In 1732, the world paused, but not dramatically. It just took a breath. Welcome to the sleepy fireside, where time moves slowly and history unfolds like a soft ripple across a still lake. Tonight, you are invited to rest alongside stories that don't demand attention, but rather hung gently in the background of thought, a companion to your dreams, and perhaps a lullaby made from facts, fragments, and forgotten footnotes. This is the story of a year where nothing happened. What 1732 brought instead was something more elusive, a sustained exhale, like the world resting its eyes for just a moment too long, not quite asleep, but no longer fully awake. Bakers kneaded dough not in frenzy, but with quiet focus. The days unfolded like a well-worn blanket, familiar, soft, and a little faded at the edges. One could forget what day it was, or even what season, because the air stayed politely temperate, the rain was never rude, and the wind merely meandered. If ever there was a year to reflect, gently, without strain, this was it. Some wrote long treatises on the virtues of stillness. Others merely stared out windows, notebooks open, but blank. Even the theologians, who usually debated endlessly about divine intention, found no new arguments. Perhaps because those years, the quiet ones, are what most of life is made of. You'll hear of royal meetings where no decisions were made, of poets inspired by silence, of weather so uneventful it became its own kind of legend, of a single child's soft sob, the loudest thing for miles. So lie back, if you haven't already. Let the hush of this forgotten year wrap around you like a familiar shawl. There is nothing you need to do, nothing to remember, and nothing at all to worry about. Not the great battles, the famous speeches, or the moments that fill headlines, but the mornings where tea is just hot enough and the evening breeze carries no news. Only a sense that, perhaps, the divine was resting too. Even the pigeons seemed less urgent in their flutters. Musicians tuned their instruments, but hesitated to play anything too rousing. Paintings were started, then left untouched. There were no feasts worth shouting about, no ceremonies that deserved elaborate preparation. Children played, but not loudly. Elders napped, often more than once a day. And in the quietest corners of the countryside, some swore they could hear the ticking of time itself, not loud or menacing, just steady, like a cat's purr in a distant room. Doors were opened and closed. Conversations began, but wandered off mid-thought. No war broke out. No monarch fell. No lands were conquered. No revolutions stirred. The baker still baked. The tailor still stitched. The mason still shaped stone. It was the kind that settles in the bones, like warmth after a bath, or the memory of a lullaby without needing to hear it. A kind of profound that asks for no action, just presence. But no one rushed. No one sought to improve, invent, or transform. There was no scandal in the courts, no surge in invention. Even the sun, it seemed, rose and set with a kind of apologetic regularity, as if not wanting to disturb anything or anyone. In dusty volumes lined up like sentinels in university libraries, that year was often nothing more than a space between two paragraphs. In some ledgers, it received no mention at all. One archivist, when asked to summarize the events of the year, simply turned the page in silence. That, he said, should be enough. And yet, perhaps it is precisely this absence, this gentle lull, that makes the year so fascinating. Imagine a time so unremarkable, so still, that it becomes remarkable by its very stillness. A year that passed not unnoticed, but unbothered. A year that left the seas calm, the crops content, and the people almost contemplative. There were no epic love stories, no volcanic eruptions, no pandemics, plagues, or even particularly noisy arguments recorded in town squares. No one declared anything to anyone, not even in whispers. And because of that, the year became quietly and almost invisibly one of the most unusual years in recorded memory. It was a year best remembered for the silence it left behind. Historians, so often drawn to years of fire and thunder, tended to gloss over 1732. You may be tempted to imagine it as a year of boredom. But boredom is a sharp word, filled with discomfort. The cities hummed with ordinary life. The markets opened at dawn and closed at dusk, with nothing too strange in between. Carts creaked by. In this gentle rhythm, time became syrupy, like honey warmed in a jar. The calendar moved forward, of course, but with none of the urgency it usually carried. The philosophers of the time, though often animated by contradiction and curiosity, found themselves in a rare agreement. It wasn't that people were idle. And maybe, somewhere in that stillness, something profound happened, though not the kind of profound we can measure. So why tell the story of a year where nothing happened? Over the next chapters, we'll wander gently through the almost events, the not quite incidents, and the nearly memorable moments of 1732, each one a ripple in still water. Because in 1732, nothing happened, and it was beautiful. In a grand room of polished stone and velvet drapery deep inside the palace of a small but orderly European kingdom, an emergency meeting of the Royal Council commenced at precisely 10 in the morning on the 7th day of March 1732. Outside, the sky hovered in a soft, indifferent gray, not hinting at rain nor promising sunlight. It sat in an unremarkable equilibrium that seemed to mirror the occasion within. The reason for the gathering was, in its own way, unprecedented. A sleeve was adjusted. A boot creaked. One minister examined his empty teacup. The transcript would later reflect the moment with a single, curious annotation, a formal record of a yawn, noted in fine script. Only one phrase was preserved at the top of the parchment, a statement both passive and profound. Below it, scribes wrote 3 dots, each dot suggesting the continuation of a moment unclaimed by urgency. The day as transcript concluded with a soft acknowledgment of the unremarkable, followed by a note on the quality of the council as biscuits. Not because of some looming danger, nor an unexpected triumph. Outside the palace, the flag above moved not with triumph nor warning, but in a lazy, irregular sway. The words were small, easily overlooked, but quietly moving. Children chased sunlight in the fields, stopping only to watch clouds pass. Elderly men sat on porches carving spoons from soft wood, knowing they had no need for more spoons, but finding satisfaction in the act alone. They observed that in a world so often defined by unrest, perhaps the absence of events was itself an event worth noticing. With careful penmanship, he added one last line to the day's record. It captured everything and nothing at once. A sentence that, in its simplicity, carried the full weight of the kingdom's heart. The year proceeds in perfect stillness. May it continue so. And with that, the story of a day without event became the quiet cornerstone of a year defined not by what happened, but by what gently, gracefully, did not. It became a reference, a tone, a memory of how even governance could bend toward the undramatic. No legislation followed, no grand declarations. And yet, its influence trickled into the folds of daily life. It spoke to a collective ease, a breath held gently, and a year allowed to unfold without interference. The palace guards, shifting in unison, breathed a slow rhythm into the afternoon. A carpenter decided not to replace his tools, which still carved perfectly fine chairs. A family chose not to rearrange their parlor, realizing they liked it just as it was. Bread was warm and buttered, tea poured in its quiet steam, and the cat, now gently rotund, spent the morning following a moth's shadow across the flagstones. Nothing extraordinary occurred, and that was increasingly the preferred state of things. One merchant, having considered expanding his shop, instead opted to repaint the shutters in the same soft green as before, renewed but unchanged. Somewhere near the west arch, the royal cat arranged itself upon a warm stone and did not move again for many hours. It bore the title, The Day That Remained Itself. Though rarely borrowed, the book found companionship among those who preferred to read before bed without being stirred awake by plot or peril. Inside, the pages offered no twists, no revelations, just the assurance of stillness kept intact. The king entered wearing the kind of expression that conveyed neither approval nor disapproval, simply readiness. Across the kingdom, people referred to the gathering with gentle reverence. They began to call it the March 7th Agreement, though it was neither signed nor sealed. A quiet policy emerged, a general consensus to preserve the calmness of the present. Villages postponed improvements not out of laziness, but from a newfound appreciation for what already was. With a single nod, those present rose and returned to their seats in one fluid motion. It was the absence of either that prompted the king's secretary to call upon every minister, scribe, and adviser to assemble. Even the royal cat made its presence known, drawn not by duty, but by a vague memory of once receiving a sardine in a previous session. The chamber filled slowly and silently. The sounds of seating of chairs easing into the floor and porcelain cups resting on saucers composed the room as only score. The secretary, with his practiced hand, unfurled a scroll and stood at the head of the table. He cleared his throat and began to recite. What emerged, in methodical cadence, was a list that held no entries. No threats loomed. No crops had failed. No dignitaries requested audience. The treasury was full, the soldiers at ease, and the churches peaceful. The roll call of nothingness extended into the quiet like a slow breath. The chamber absorbed it with respectful stillness. As the recitation concluded, the room stirred only faintly. Deliberation followed, soft as mist. The assembled minds considered whether to proceed with routine policies. A balance of order, unthreatened and undisturbed, gave little cause to shift direction. Discussions leaned more toward reflection than resolution. Would silence and peace be worth documenting? Could stillness itself warrant preservation? In the end, the record of the day included no decisions. When the council dispersed, the participants stepped into corridors, still wrapped in the same quiet air they had left behind. The following weeks held to the rhythm of that March morning. The policy of contented stillness found subtle expression in daily life. At the Royal Archives, the chief chronicler collected the records into a slim booklet bound in gentle blue linen. In the margins of the official transcript, one of the junior scribes left a note in faint ink. And so the kingdom moved onward, without force or interruption. Bees hummed through blossoms with unhurried purpose. The council meeting faded not into obscurity, but into something gentler. By the following day, the palace had resumed its usual rhythm. Back in the archives, a single scribe returned to the entry from March 7th. In the quiet aftermath of the royal council's most uneventful assembly, the kingdom continued in its unshaken rhythm. Morning bells chimed without urgency. Market stalls opened precisely on time. Bread rose in ovens without collapsing. A passing feeling, easily brushed away. Have we forgotten something? A candlemaker asked aloud one gray morning while trimming wicks. He said it to no one, not even himself. But the thought lingered like the scent of wax after the flame had gone. Even the moonlight seemed to fall with practiced precision across rooftops as though rehearsed. A cobbler laced a shoe, only to untie it again, confused about why it felt both finished and not. Not the peaceful kind, but the curious kind. Not unsettling, not yet, but softly puzzling. A schoolboy looked up from his lessons and blinked at the wall, wondering if he was supposed to be somewhere else, though he wasn't. Gertrude said aloud, "Could it be that we are surviving, and no one knows it?" Yet somewhere within this perfect regularity, a faint murmur began to rise, not from a bell tower or trumpet. One man looked skyward, as though expecting an answer from the clouds. In Willowmere, a baker began adding an extra loaf to his morning batch. not because anyone asked, but because it felt like something someone might soon need. He said it with a smile, but his hands worked more slowly after. In Hollowford, the postmaster started writing letters to himself, beginning each one with "just in case." No one found it strange, but none came, just the wind, as gentle as ever, but from within the hearts of those who, without reason, began to wonder. He printed pamphlets titled Chronicle of the Still, which many kept under pillows for reasons they couldn't quite explain. It was not sold, not praised, but many stood before it in silence. On it, a handwritten label read, "Lost and not found." Inside, villagers placed odd tokens: a dull button, a ribbon, a stone that looked like all the others. Bakers baked, tailors tailored, cats napped in windowsills. But the kingdom now shared a quiet, gentle knowledge that even in the absence of change, something had changed. They had become aware of the stillness, not as emptiness, but as presence. When asked why, Corin shrugged and replied, just in case something used to be missing. And in time, they stopped wondering too, because even the wondering was a form of disturbance. And the year did not want disturbance. It wanted ... itself, so they let it be. One woman said it felt like remembering a dream she had never had. It was her routine, unchanged for decades. And yet, as her fingers folded the flour and water together, they would sip tea and hum and sometimes speak, but often not. Is the world waiting for something? One woman asked once, eyes distant. Or have we simply arrived? She found herself whispering to the cat perched on her window ledge. What if we've forgotten to remember something? If everything stays the same, will it ever feel different? One girl asked while watching rain slide down a window, not heavily, just persistently. Only a strange sort of reverence, for the pause, for the quiet, for the space between things. People began walking more slowly, not because they were tired, but because it felt better to match the pace of the world. They paused longer at crossroads, not for traffic, but to look around at buildings that hadn't changed, trees that hadn't dropped a leaf, skies that hadn't decided on sunshine or shadow. Can we lose something we never had? Another asked while bouncing a stone across puddles that all looked alike. There, she found others doing the same. Shopkeepers without customers. Customers without shopping lists. Children sitting with toys untouched. They weren't bored, just waiting. At first, it was a thought barely strong enough to register. Across town, similar moments occurred. A seamstress paused while threading her needle, suddenly unsure whether she had completed the last stitch. In these tiny moments, spread thin like butter across bread, the kingdom began to notice something unusual, a silence within the silence. In the village of Avonsford, an elderly woman named Gertrude, known for her braided buns and gently humming voice, stirred her morning dough with slow, deliberate hands. The cat, as cats do, blinked once and resumed its cleaning. Later that morning, she wandered to the village square, under the guise of errands, but more truthfully, out of curiosity. And then, as naturally as a leaf falls when it's ready, heads turned. No one laughed, no one argued. A few nodded. That question, simple as it was, floated like a feather through town after town. A tailor in Greyhill started sewing an extra button inside every coat lining, saying, "You never know when you'll need something more than nothing." Even children felt it. They began to ask questions that didn't quite have answers. Their parents, used to answering questions about bedtime and vegetables, found themselves quietly stumped. And yet no panic set in. There was no fear in the air, no nervousness, no sense of threat. In town meetings, normally held to discuss drainage or lantern oil, villagers began gathering just to sit. A scholar in the capital began cataloging the absences of 1732, a growing list of things that didn't happen. Wars not fought, diseases not spread, monarchs not overthrown. An artist in the countryside painted a large canvas of solid blue. He called it The Day After Nothing. Elsewhere, a boy named Corin, quiet and soft-spoken, placed a small wooden box in the middle of the town square. No one argued. The box remained. It never overflowed nor emptied, just quietly accepted what was offered. And so life went on. People no longer asked, "What did we forget?" Instead, they wondered, "What is this that we're feeling?" There was a time when poets reached for thunder, for war, for glory, for the impossible entanglement of love and loss. They scribbled sonnets during sieges, rhymed rebellions into memory, and turned heartbreak into stanzas strong enough to outlast lifetimes. But in 1732, they found themselves reaching instead for something far more elusive, the echo of silence. He had once written about storms and battles, or at least imagined them well enough to fill his pages. But lately, no such images came. He listened to birdsong that never changed, watched clouds that barely moved, and waited for inspiration that never arrived with urgency, only with the gentlest suggestion. Perhaps there is something worth writing in this stillness. It began, as many things do, with a page left blank. In a modest cottage tucked between two moss-covered hills, a young poet named Emil sat each morning before a desk facing east, waiting for the sun to creep across the room and warm the corner of his parchment. Other poets, no longer chasing heroism or heartbreak, turned inward. Their work began to soften. Lines became shorter, syllables slower. Poems read more like whispers. There was one about a cup left untouched beside a window, another about the exact moment a breeze stopped rustling a curtain. Submissions were judged not on rhythm or rhyme, but on how little they said while still evoking something. The winner was a single line written in pencil, a breath, still warm, with nowhere to go. And so, one morning, after days of letting the quill hover, Emil pressed the tip to the page and wrote nothing at all. But most readers didn't mind. In fact, many appreciated that these new works could be read without stirring the heart too deeply. On the wall, a sign read, "The view describes itself." The new format, called the Festival of Almost, required that all entries be unfinished. Poets read the first lines, then stopped, or the last lines, and nothing more. Some began their readings and simply sighed. One poet brought only a title, "Things I Might Have Written If I'd Been Awake," and received a standing ovation, performed entirely in slow nods. Visitors came from all around to sit, watch the landscape, and write nothing. Many left without speaking a word. How can something without structure or climax be called poetry? They demanded. They were not meant to awaken, but to soothe. Their odes to quiet. Their verses that drifted like mist. But to those who lived it, it needed no name. It was simply the time when poetry exhaled, when blankness became sacred, when silence rhymed better than any word. In doing so, they shaped a record not of events, but of the space between events. A memory of how it felt to be alive when nothing seemed to happen. But everything somehow did. Not from frustration or defeat, but because the blankness felt more accurate than anything he could write. These were not performances, but gatherings where poets would hold up blank pages, or recite only the title of their poem, and then pause for a length of time proportionate to its unwritten verses. The audience, rather than applauding, would simply nod. Some closed their eyes. A few drifted into nap-like states. One reading famously ended with every attendee asleep on hay bales in a candlelit barn, including the poet himself. This empty page became the first poem in his now celebrated collection, Nothing and Everything, a slim volume made entirely of unwritten verses. Scholars debated whether the absence of text was a statement or simply a lapse. Artists argued that it was the most honest reflection of the year they had yet seen. Some poems became so gentle in their message they were indistinguishable from diary entries or grocery lists. One famous piece was mistakenly printed in a ledger of tax receipts, and no one noticed for weeks. Common folk, meanwhile, began purchasing copies to place beside their beds, or on shelves where they could glance at them from time to time, as if to say, "Yes, I too remember that feeling." The poems weren't blank because there was nothing to say, but because there was so much that didn't need to be said. They captured moments too tender for language. The hush before snowfall, the space between one footstep and the next, the soft pause after laughter fades. Just 30 pages of carefully handmade paper, each bearing a neat border but no words. It was sold in bookstores between heavy novels and treatises on empire, often mistaken for a journal. But those who opened it knew otherwise. Within weeks, Nothing and Everything began to quietly travel across the kingdom. The book's quiet success sparked a subtle movement among the creative minds of the time. Critics didn't know what to make of it. One reviewer described the movement as literary sleepwalking. Another declared it a revolution of restraint. Soon, poetry readings transformed into what became known as silent circles. At the Royal Academy of Arts, a competition was held, the Quiet Quill Prize. When the poet, a woman named Leora, was asked what inspired her work, she simply replied, "I wrote it while watching bread rise." Others followed her example. And yet, in all this quiet creation, something beautiful was forming, not an art of emptiness, but an art of attentiveness. In the mountain town of Grello, a tiny museum was founded with a single exhibit, a chair placed beside a window overlooking the valley. It was during this time that the annual poetry festival in the capital, usually a noisy affair filled with declarations and contests, was quietly reimagined. Of course, not everyone embraced the shift. Some traditionalists accused the movement of laziness, of indulgent vagueness, to which the answer often came, softly but firmly, because life has no climax either, not every day, not this year. And so, the poets kept writing or not writing, their tributes to nothing. Later, scholars would look back and call it the Whispering Period. And all across the kingdom, as night fell softly upon that year of subtle breath, candles burned low beside pages barely marked, and hearts beat calmly, in time with poems left gently unfinished. In the long memory of 1732, the year that unfolded gently without urgency, one quiet occurrence etched itself into more minds than expected. It was not a coronation, nor the sighting of a comet. Its form rested between firmness and softness, its crust offering a sheen that hinted at subtle dignity. No overbaking, no pale undercooking. His beard curled with the steam of many mornings. No secret recipes lived in his flour-dusted kitchen. No notes were pinned to the wall, bearing exotic instructions from foreign lands. His methods were habitual, his movements calm, each day indistinguishable from the one before. And yet, on a morning just like any other, his bread emerged with a wholeness that transcended intention. No crowds gathered, but a steady rhythm of visitors made their way to the bakery. They did not knock or request. They stood, looked, and left with a kind of gentleness in their step. The bread became an unspoken attraction. Its surface stayed smooth, its crust unchanged. No staleness crept in. Scientists visited with mild equipment. Measurements were taken, charts were made. And yet, the results added little. The bread persisted in its gentle perfection, unbothered by analysis. From the village bakery in Ellingshire, a scent drifted light, hesitant, as if uncertain whether to linger in the street or disappear into the morning mist. Still, it remained dignified. When its transformation could no longer be ignored, Thomlin took a clean wooden box, lined it with linen, and placed the loaf inside. In letters, it surfaced as metaphor. Artists reimagined it, each time different, each time the same. Instead, what endured was the atmosphere it created, a moment of quiet recognition, a pause within the motion of life. They captured not the bread's appearance, but the stillness it left behind. He walked behind the bakery to the old willow tree, but in Ellingshire, the loaf became a point of balance, a mark of invisible gravity, something to remember when everything else seemed too much. It became part of the collective rhythm, recalled not as a miracle, but as a moment that felt complete. And so the year continued, slowly, gently, with enough light, enough warmth, enough space. The bread remained buried, but never forgotten. And above the roots of the old tree, the wind passed often, soft as flour on a baker's sleeve. No one followed. No one asked questions. Beneath that tree, he laid the box in the earth and covered it in silence. No stone, no plaque. It required no action. It asked for no response. It was not part of a movement or message. It simply was. In this, people found a rare kind of comfort. The permission to stop, to witness, to breathe in without striving. Just the soft presence of roots and memory. A painter stood for hours and later produced a canvas of blank, warm tones. One person said the bread reminded them of a feeling they couldn't name. Others said nothing at all. Each day, new loaves emerged, tasty, fresh, familiar. But none matched the unintentional harmony of that one loaf. Without speeches or applause, people gathered in the square and brought objects that represented their own versions of sufficiency. It found a place in the town hall where it received no fanfare, only the occasional glance from a passerby. Children would pause before it on rainy days. Elders would stand in front of it, not to explain, but to remember. A folded quilt, a pebble polished by river water, a song hummed barely above breath. There were no contests, no declarations, just a shared moment of mutual understanding. Thomlin made no attempt to reproduce it. When asked in passing, he would respond with a quiet nod, his hands moving in flour as always. The air around it stilled. Those who passed by slowed their steps, not in wonder, but in instinctive reverence. No philosopher was born. No king met his end. Instead, the focal point of recollection became a simple loaf of bread. The bakery's coals had already burned steady for hours. It bore no extravagant markings, just a trio of soft surface cracks that opened like petals, not to shout, but to suggest. That day they hesitated. Feet stopped before the window. Faces tilted, curious. Someone removed their hat without knowing why. The loaf sat untouched behind clean glass. It was not for sale, but no sign said so. There was simply no attempt to place a value on it. Its symmetry spoke of effortless balance, not calculation. In its quiet form, there was presence. When the loaf was removed and placed on the cooling shelf, it gave off a slow, deliberate warmth. For a while, Thomlin went about his day binding herbs, brushing flour into neat piles. Then, as the kitchen light shifted with the sun, something subtle brought his attention back. This was not any ordinary bread. As records would later observe, it was simply perfect. The baker, Thomlin, was an unassuming man with hands seasoned by repetition. It happened just after dawn, under a sky pale with indifference. The loaf rested in silence. Its shape was humble, its lines smooth. As the morning passed, villagers began their customary visits to the bakery. Throughout the day, a few travelers appeared, having heard rumors from nearby towns. A small wooden bench was placed outside, unannounced. People sat quietly. Some brought notebooks and stared without writing. Days passed. The loaf remained. It did not spoil. The baker, unchanged by attention, continued his work. In time, the village marked the occurrence with a modest ceremony. A tapestry followed, woven by local hands. It depicted the loaf in quiet rest atop its wooden shelf. The loaf itself, after many weeks, began to fade. Its color softened. Its body dipped slightly in the center. Years passed. The story of the bread became a gentle refrain in village life. It was told without urgency. In classrooms, it was mentioned between lessons. What lingered in memory was not the flavor, for none had tasted it. Not the method, for it had never changed. At a time when the world seemed content with stillness, the bread offered something rare, presence without demand. Historians might catalog that year with blank entries and empty margins. In a quiet village named Norley, where the trees leaned just slightly from years of mild wind, and the air smelled faintly of hay and old wood, something peculiar happened in April of 1732. The day had begun like all others, with the slow toll of the bell, the clatter of breakfast bowls. 2 quiet tears rolled down his cheeks, and then, just as easily as they came, they stopped. His breath remained steady, his body still, his eyes fixed on the shadow of a bird crossing the ground in front of him. The tears had arrived like passing weather, brief, sincere, and without warning, not to investigate or inquire, but to stand near the place where the tears had fallen. It read, at approximately mid-morning, a child cried softly beside the fountain. No reason noted. Emotion appeared genuine. No further action required. That entry would later be regarded as one of the most moving of the decade, not for its poetry, but for its honesty. In a year where nothing seemed to require attention, this moment stood gently apart. A blank poem that won an award, and the spoon of a philosopher who never finished a sentence. He married, raised children, and taught them to listen to trees before cutting them. In the final years of his life, he would sometimes sit near the fountain again, whittling slowly, watching shadows move across the stones. He did not speak of the tearful morning, but those who saw him sitting there often felt they had witnessed something whole, a stillness that had come full circle. Visitors often stop at the embroidery longer than they expect to. Some blink quickly, unsure why. A few write in the guest book, noting that the silver thread seemed to shimmer like memory itself. They stood in pairs or alone, hands folded behind backs, as if the space held some gentle truth. No questions were asked, no judgments made. Some sat on the nearby bench, looking toward the square, saying nothing at all. He never cried again that year, at least not where anyone saw. He spoke little of the moment. When asked about it years later, he would tilt his head and smile. He said it had visited him like a soft breeze and had left the same way. He did not consider it remarkable, but he did remember it, as one remembers a tune they heard only once, yet never forgot. A carpenter left a single sprig of rosemary on the edge of the stone. It stayed there for 3 days, then was taken away by the wind. The melody rose and dipped in the shape of a sigh, like someone remembering something they could not name. They called it Ulrich's Moment. It became popular not for its catchiness, but for the stillness it seemed to create wherever it was sung. It was said that even animals paused when it floated through the air, as if they too recognized the shape of a quiet feeling. His mother, standing nearby at the market stall, turned at the smallest shift in his posture and came to his side. She did not rush. She only rested a hand on his back, sensing something she could not name. She stitched a panel no larger than a dinner plate, depicting a child seated beneath the silhouette of a bare-branched tree. 2 fine silver threads trailed from the eyes, catching the light only if one looked closely. She hung the work above the hearth in the town's gathering hall. It bore no label. None was needed. People understood what it was. They came to sit beneath it, sometimes with tea, sometimes with a quiet book, as if the embroidery radiated a kind of calm, and the light tread of feet across cool stone paths. He wasn't sad, he said, not exactly, nor frightened or tired. He had just felt. And now he didn't anymore. His mother nodded and sat beside him, brushing crumbs from his sleeve. They remained there a while, neither speaking, the sound of water trickling behind them. There was no need to explain what had happened. Not then, not ever. Nothing felt unusual, not loudly, not urgently. but softly, as things often do in a year like that. One woman mentioned it to the baker, who then told the cobbler's wife, who murmured it at the well. By evening, the entire village knew. A child had cried that morning, only once, without cause or injury, but with such gentleness that the day itself had seemed to hold its breath. People did not gossip. They only nodded, quietly reflecting on it as though they had seen a leaf fall perfectly into the curve of a stream. Yet as the mist lifted from the well and the roosters gave their second call, a small boy named Ulrich sat beside the central fountain, watching the morning unfold, and began to cry. There was no wailing, no gasp, no outburst. Ulrich looked up and said that he had felt something, and that it had left. He could not describe it. Word spread through Nornley by late afternoon. Several villagers visited the fountain over the next few days. The town's record keeper, a patient man with round spectacles and a fondness for documenting the mundane, wrote a simple entry for April 4th. An embroiderer named Elspeth decided to capture the scene in thread. Ulrich continued growing in the way most children do. Slowly, then all at once. In time, a lullaby emerged in Nornley. It had no words, only a hum, passed from mother to child, from grandparent to grandchild. Eventually, the embroidery was sent to the regional museum in Fenvale, where it now hangs next to other gentle artifacts of the year. A loaf that was never eaten. Ulrich lived a quiet life as a woodcarver. He made spoons and bowls, never rushed, always smooth to the touch. In the middle of Nornley's old square, shaded by elms and stone walls smoothed by generations of elbows, there was a chess table built into the earth itself. It had no official name, but people quietly called it the thinking table. Two elderly men, Tom and Edric, met there every Thursday. Their faces were as familiar to the bench as the wind was to the leaves. A child with a ribbon in her hair skipped past, peering curiously at the two old men sitting motionless. They sat again, as before, across from one another. A few just came to listen to the quiet. No one ever asked the men to explain. No one dared touch the board. They'd brought cushions for the bench, now harder against their backs. But after the third week, Edric arrived alone, placed 2 cups of tea on the table, and sat in the same position, facing no one. It read, "Here, in 1732, 2 friends paused over a bishop. They never resolved it. They never needed to. Schoolchildren were brought there on field trips. Artists painted the scene over and over again. One particularly quiet morning, a poet left a note under a smooth rock. It said, 'The wisest argument is the one that never ends.' The note was added to the local museum's collection of quiet things. The bishop still leaned gently into its uncertain square. He didn't move a piece. He didn't look at the bishop. He simply sat and remained. The pieces are not protected by rope or glass, but by memory and custom. No one has dared continue the game. It sits beneath the same trees, beside the same bench, worn now by decades of stillness. In a year when little else happened, this moment stood out, not for its drama, but for its calm refusal to move forward. In the long silence of 1732, 2 friends showed that even disagreement, when tended to carefully, can become something tender, something worth returning to, something that asks nothing, explains little, and endures. For 7 more weeks, he returned. Then he too stopped. The table was left untouched, the board frozen mid-game, the pieces gathering no dust, because villagers would gently clean them with cloths brought from home. No one asked who had been right. No one wanted to. They needed longer pauses between movements, though none were ever made. Edric's hands began to tremble. Tom's eyes stayed longer on the same square. Still, they sat in silence, week after week, guarding a question neither of them seemed eager to answer. The game had long since passed from competition into ritual. It was no longer about bishops or rules, but about time, dignity, and the patience between people who understood one another too well to insist. It became something sacred, not in a religious sense, but in the way certain moments become delicate simply by persisting. The bishop stood as a monument not to action, but to hesitation. It symbolized the kind of gentle resistance that only friends could maintain without resentment. No pieces moved. No explanation was offered. The silence was never heavy. If anything, it felt respectful, a kind of mutual understanding that the matter, though small, deserved care. Children began calling it the never-ending game. A small sign was placed on a nearby bench that read, "Please be quiet. Thought is taking place." People abided, and the moment continued to stretch gently across time. Word spread slowly, in the way things do in small towns that are half awake. The librarian paused by her window, seeing the frozen scene. The baker, delivering bread to the chapel, tipped his cap in quiet acknowledgement. A small circle of villagers began to stop by each Thursday, wondering whether the game would resume. For over 30 years, their games were slow, deliberate, and unspoken. They never kept score. They never rushed. Their weekly match was less about victory and more about the stillness of habit, the steady rhythm of shared attention. On one unusually quiet Thursday in May of 1732, the match began as always. The board was clean, the pieces placed carefully by hands that remembered their shapes even with eyes that had grown dim. Edric played white. Tom answered with black. A pawn here, a knight there, and the afternoon drifted by like a slow river. Then, without much ceremony, Edric moved his bishop in a direction Tom found questionable. The bishop slid into a square Tom believed was protected, perhaps even illegal. He didn't speak. He simply paused, fingers hovering above a countering move, then slowly pulled them back. It was not a harsh silence. There was no frown, no sigh. But something in the air changed. Edric noticed, though he said nothing either. He gently placed both hands on the edge of the table and looked down at the bishop, then back to Tom. They exchanged a glance, long, thoughtful, unhurried. There was no anger in it, just a quiet disagreement resting between them like a pebble on calm water. Neither man reached for the board again. They sat, not arguing, but considering. The bishop sat still, just slightly misaligned, as though even it were unsure of its position. People passed, as they always did. A cartwheel creaked over cobblestone. A dog barked once in the distance, then thought better of it. But it didn't. When Tom and Edric returned the next week, the board was untouched. The bishop remained where it had landed. Over the following weeks, the scene became woven into the fabric of the village. Some came with baskets of apples, others with sketchbooks. The men grew older, but still they came. Eventually, Tom stopped coming. No one said anything at first. Years later, the town placed a small bronze plaque on the stone wall near the table. And so the board remains. High in the wooden rafters of Norley's small chapel, nestled between beams smoothed by decades of sun and smoke, a single gray bird made its home. No one recalled the exact moment it arrived. It had not been brought there, nor noticed in any grand way. It simply appeared one spring morning, perched near the bell tower, observing the quiet rituals of life below. The wind still stirred the ivy along the chapel's eastern wall, but the melody was absent. At first, no one thought much of it. Perhaps the bird was elsewhere. The schoolteacher paused at her window each morning to check. It reminded him of youth, when he would wake before anyone else and just breathe. One evening, she climbed into the attic above the chapel, sketchbook in hand, hoping to capture its shape. The light was low, and dust floated like thought through the beams. Instead, they greeted the mornings as they were, full of soft sounds, of leaves brushing, shutters creaking, the distant roll of wheels. In the bird's silence, they discovered their own. It existed gently among beams and bells, teaching those below how to feel what went unfelt. The silence became part of the landscape, not something missing, but something complete in its own right. In the long memory of Nornley, people would speak of the bird not as a legend, but as a moment that unfolded across a season, then stayed folded, soft and small and whole. Children learned to sit quietly and listen for things without names. Adults walked slower, breathed deeper. One man began recording each morning, not to catch a melody, but to remember the shape of quiet. The tapes were played in the library's listening room, now a space for sitting with nothing in particular. After nearly an hour of waiting, the bird appeared. It landed gently above her, turned its head, and looked down. Snow gathered at the edge of the stained glass, and the air inside the chapel held its breath. The bird remained silent, and yet the village felt full. When asked why it mattered, an old woman once said, "Because it reminds us that things don't have to speak to be heard." In a year that changed little, the bird reminded everyone that change could happen not through action, but through presence, the act of choosing stillness over repetition. The artist later wrote that she didn't draw it. She simply watched, because the bird seemed to be watching back. A local weaver composed a short piece on her loom, a pattern of thread in 3 quiet repetitions, calling it Bird Song in Pause. And a potter shaped a vase whose opening tilted slightly to one side, as if listening. In a year where little was celebrated, this absence became something quietly revered. The bird became something sacred in its silence, a symbol of something no one quite named. Some began arriving early to the chapel steps, listening not for a melody, but for the weight of its absence. She didn't speak of it often, but those who knew her said her work grew softer, more open. She painted not birds, but stillness, not scenes, but spaces. In one watercolor, a pale sky sits above a single line of trees. At the corner, a tiny shape barely visible, not a bird, but a shadow of where a sound once lived. It was called After the Third Note. Visitors stared at it longer than any of her other works. Some said it felt like standing near a memory you couldn't explain. They sat quietly, feeling the morning in new ways, the stretch of wood beams above, the way light touched cold stone, the hush of the world before it fully woke. Perhaps it had flown lower or been caught in sleep, but the silence continued the next day and the next. And yet the bird still came. It still perched in its usual place, still fluffed its feathers, still blinked down at the pews below, but it no longer sang. Its feathers were soft and ordinary, a gentle shade of ash with no brilliant flashes or uncommon markings. Yet it soon became familiar to the villagers, not for how it looked, but for how it sounded. Each dawn, just before the chapel bell rang, it would sing. The song was not loud, not ambitious. It contained no acrobatics of melody, just 3 simple notes, soft and measured, repeated as if stitched into the morning. They drifted through the chapel windows and down the stone path, winding through garden gates and empty streets. There was no faltering, no broken notes, no attempt and failure. It was as if the bird had turned its voice inward, deciding to listen instead. A few wondered if it had grown ill, but it moved with energy. Others speculated that it had forgotten its tune, but its gaze remained calm and alert. The silence felt less like absence and more like a decision, a purposeful stillness that was never explained. The notes arrived like gentle footsteps before the village stirred, marking the moment where night gave way to day. The bird never varied its tune. In its simplicity, it became dependable, like bread, like breath, like time. Then, one morning in early June, the song did not come. The bell still rang. What startled the villagers most was the completeness of the quiet. Over time, the missing song became a subject of soft conversation. The baker mentioned it while measuring flour. An elderly gardener, whose hearing had faded in recent years, said he liked the silence more. Then came the artist. She was young, from the edge of town, and had heard stories about the bird that chose silence. The encounter changed her. Eventually, the villagers stopped waiting for the bird to sing again. They stopped expecting. By winter, the bird still came, resting above the pulpit where no sermons were given. The bird never left. It was not named, not claimed, not chased. For an entire year, the village of Nornley sat beneath a sky that never quite shifted. It wasn't that the weather was extreme. There were no storms, no droughts, no records broken. Dew clung to the grass in tidy arrangements. The rooster crowed not out of instinct, but seemingly from habit, always at the same pause in the breeze. Curtains were drawn back with the expectation of mildness. Farmers looked to the sky not for forecasts, but for confirmation of what they already knew. Even the sun itself seemed reluctant to vary its warmth, casting a steady glow that neither invited basking nor demanded shade. Another simply repeated the word temperate 15 times across the page. A few townsfolk claimed to see differences that weren't there. It rippled softly, but never bent in surprise. Scarecrows stood quietly, undisturbed by gusts. Farmers harvested in silence, their work too smooth to require comment. A cloud shaped like a boat, a fog that stayed past breakfast, a snowflake out of season. Just the same even calm, folding itself neatly into another chapter. The villagers gathered in the square to mark the transition not with fireworks or bonfires, but with a moment of collective stillness. They stood in silence, looking up, and thanked the weather, not for what it had done, but for how gently it had refused to change. A few villagers began trading dreams of weather they missed. They called it the year of the unshifting air. Elders would smile when they heard the name and say, it was the kind of weather that tucked you in, not the kind that knocked. And whenever the wind grew wild in later years, people would close their shutters, not out of fear, but with a quiet thought, remembering that once, long ago, everything held still. One man spoke fondly of hail that once chased him into a hay barn. A young woman recalled thunder that shook her window pane in just the right way to make her feel small and alive. Their stories became offerings, shared like spices in a town that had forgotten heat. At the market, produce looked identical week after week. Apples bore the same blush, potatoes the same weight. Even the strawberries, usually rebellious with spots and variation, aligned in neat patterns. It was beautiful in a way, but eerie in another, as if nature, too, had grown cautious of disrupting the rhythm. They would point at clouds and say, that one looks a bit darker, or squint at the horizon, insisting they felt a breeze. Even when leaves remained still, she logged the difference in millimeters. I know it's changing, she would say, just not enough to notice without looking hard. Her notebooks filled with small, careful numbers. Some nights she read them aloud to her cat, who blinked slowly in agreement. To Dora, the constancy was not dull. It was delicate. She saw the effort it took for the world to stay so gently balanced. To her, the sameness was not a flaw, but a kind of quiet devotion. It wasn't dissatisfaction they felt, not quite. It was the discomfort of living inside a sky that had nothing more to say. The days followed one another like pages from a gently copied book. Birds landed on it without concern, knowing it would not turn beneath them. It pointed west for months on end, not out of meteorological truth, but because it had nothing else to do. A local boy tried to spin it by hand, but the elders stopped him, saying, let it be. If the wind isn't ready to change, we shouldn't force it. And so the vane remained, a sculpture rather than a tool, a monument to a direction no longer questioned. The sun rose and set as expected. The winds came and went with polite restraint. Clouds appeared in modest formations, never gathering enough weight to frighten, nor vanishing entirely to impress. The children no longer chased puddles because there were none. Gardeners grew restless among blossoms that bloomed precisely as expected, then lingered too long. No leaf seemed in a hurry to turn. No gust of wind dared to surprise. It was as if the entire landscape had settled into a deep, unwavering sigh. The villagers began to miss the smallest variations, the first frost, the sudden sneeze of spring. Rain, when it fell, was fine as silk and brief as breath. It was, simply put, the most forgettable weather anyone had ever lived through. And yet, its sameness began to feel like something rare. Each morning, the light touched the rooftops at nearly the same angle. At first, the villagers welcomed it. There were no ruined crops, no mudslides, no sudden chills. Laundry dried evenly. Picnics went uninterrupted. The blacksmith's forge held a consistent heat, and the baker never needed to adjust her oven for humidity. Weddings could be planned without a second thought. The apothecary, who had long suffered joint aches tied to barometric changes, declared himself cured. It was, in many ways, a kind of peace, a climate of agreement between earth and sky, where nothing was asked for and nothing denied. But by mid-year, something subtle shifted. Not in the weather itself, it remained perfectly unchanged, but in how the people experienced it. Some began keeping journals of the weather, hoping to catch a moment of deviation. One entry read, "Morning, clear. Noon, clear. Evening, clear." The village weather vane, once proud atop the chapel spire, grew stiff from disuse. In the fields, the wheat grew tall and gold, precisely as it had the year before. One woman, a retired midwife named Dora, began measuring the length of each shadow at noon. Still, there were those who longed for a shift. Not a storm, but something different. When the year ended, the sky remained unchanged. The final day of December dawned with the same pale blue it had carried since January. No snowfall, no sudden gale. Long after that year passed, the children of Nornley remembered it not as the year of drought or flood, but as the year when the sky was gentle. In the quiet corners of Nornley, tucked between the fields and the winding brook, lived a historian named Ellis Fairmere. He was not a man of pomp or renown, but in the town's rhythm, he was a kind of keeper or listener to days past, a recorder of things small and large. Births were recorded in one column, harvests in another. Marriages had their own page. Occasional sketches illustrated the bloom of a new flower or the redesign of a shop window. He walked the village lanes, asking quiet questions, hoping for a spark. History, after all, relied on friction, on changes however slight. A shift in leadership, a war, a movement of people, a flood or a feast. He invented a small tale about a traveler who mistook Nornley for another town and stayed for 3 days without realizing his error. "Soon," he said. "It is coming along." But in truth, the pages remained empty. He sat at his desk and dipped his pen in ink. On the first page of the 1732 Chronicle, he wrote a single sentence. This year, time flowed without interruption, and that was enough. Then he added his initials and the date. He closed the book, wrapped it in cloth, and placed it on the shelf alongside the others. It was thinner than the rest, lighter in hand. But when he held it, he did not feel failure. He felt truth. One night, unable to sleep, he walked to the chapel and sat in the pews alone. No one asked to see the book. No one demanded a story. They brought bread and cider. They watched the last light leave the sky. Someone hummed a tune without name. It was, in its own way, a record of the year not in words, but in shared silence. Not every moment must be recorded in drama. Not every chapter must rise and fall. Sometimes the truest story is the one where nothing much happened, except life, continuing gently, breath after breath, beneath a sky that held steady. Ellis stood at the edge of the square, hand tucked behind his back, watching the gentle hush settle over everyone like the snow that never came. The silence inside echoed with memories of past readings, the way the villagers leaned in, the rustle of turning pages, the soft laugh when someone's name appeared unexpectedly in print. Scholars who visited expected it to be symbolic or cleverly encoded. But when they turned the pages and found nearly all of them blank, they were confused. One historian called it a refusal to exaggerate. Another called it the most honest record of contentment ever penned. Visitors from afar came to see it the chronicle that captured nothing, and yet somehow recorded everything. Over time, its single sentence was quoted, embroidered, and even carved into a wooden bench near the chapel. Time flowed without interruption, and that was enough. This year, he feared there would be nothing to gather them for. But as he read it back to himself, he sighed. It sounded like a dream, not a chronicle. The lines blurred too easily. He feared including it would betray the honesty of his records. And so, fiction too was set aside, a discarded branch too smooth to carve meaning from. But this year had offered no edges, no ripples. It was like trying to draw a bowl of water with no reflections. He stared at the blank parchment for hours, pen in hand, waiting for a sentence to arrive that might open the door. None came, but the cobbler spoke only of shoelaces. The apiarist, of bees that behaved exactly as they always had. A pale orange tabby named Minnie, who belonged to the miller's niece. Minnie had spent most of the year lying in a sunny patch beside the flour sacks. Ellis tried to frame it as a symbol. Perhaps Minnie's stillness represented the town as peaceful pace. But the metaphor felt forced. He crossed it out. Then he tried recounting the time a wheelbarrow rolled slightly downhill before being stopped by a hedge. He called it the almost event, but even that felt too ambitious. He crossed that out as well. Even the gossips in the square had nothing more to offer than sighs about weather so mild it had barely been noticed. No weddings, no fires, no lost cats, no surprises. Just the long, gentle unfolding of time, unchanged. He included moments of joy and sorrow in equal measure. The chronicles were not dramatic, but they were loved. Every year, on the last Sunday of December, villagers gathered to read aloud from the book, A Soft Ceremony for a Soft Town. His home, part study and part archive, was filled with ledgers, ink pots, worn maps, and dates written in careful hand. His work was modest. He did not chase grand revelations. Instead, he noted the turning of seasons, the naming of roads, the stories whispered at dusk. Each year, Ellis compiled the Nornley Chronicle, a handwritten book, bound in simple leather that captured the essence of the passing 12 months. But in 1732, something peculiar happened. Or rather, did not happen. The days flowed as usual. The sun rose and set. Children played. Sheep grazed. But when Ellis sat at his desk in early November to begin composing that year's chronicle, he realized something unsettling. He could not find anything to write. He flipped back through his journals, calendar notations, public records, and personal observations. There were meals, certainly. There were walks and naps and church bells. But none of it felt different enough to be recorded. It was as though the year had passed like breath vital, but invisible. At first, Ellis assumed he had overlooked something. Surely a visitor had passed through, or a minor squabble had occurred at the inn. Ellis felt uneasy, not disappointed in the year itself. It had been kind, even generous in its ease, but in the absence of material. Out of desperation, he began writing about a cat. Eventually, Ellis turned to fiction. If reality refused to stir, perhaps imagination might lend a hand. As the final week of the year approached, the villagers began asking, gently, about the chronicle. Ellis smiled and nodded. Then, on the last morning of the year, Ellis made his decision. That evening, instead of a reading, the villagers gathered simply to sit together. In the years that followed, the Chronicle of 1732 became something of a legend. And so, in a year where the world seemed to pause, when even weather declined to surprise, history itself bowed its head in quiet agreement. In a little shed at the edge of the village, just beyond the line where garden plots met open field, a man named Tolan spent most of his days surrounded by springs, spoons, ears, folded diagrams, and quiet hopes. He was not famous, nor particularly social, but everyone in Nornley knew him as the Tinkerer. Not because he built anything of particular use, but because he was always adjusting something: a broom handle, a kettle hinge, a wind chime made of forks. His hands were never still, and neither, it seemed, was his mind. A few peeked through the half-open door, but saw only Tolan bent over his work, brow calm, movements deliberate. He stepped back, rubbed the dust from his hands, and regarded the creation. It did not spin, hum, glow, or tick. It simply stood, quietly complete, on the corner of his table. He waited for it to speak, to hum or shift or reveal its purpose. But nothing happened. It did not move. It did not change. Among the items found, beside bundles of twine and small screw-top jars of polished pebbles, was the box. It was opened with care, revealing the unknown object resting as peacefully as when it was first made. No one could determine what it was meant for. A few guessed it might be a kind of timer. Others thought it decorative. One child said it looked like the sound of rain. It was placed on a shelf in the local hall, labeled only as the Almost Invention. After an hour of silence, Tolan leaned forward and whispered, "What are you?" It became a kind of local emblem, not of failure, but of patience. That purpose can live in pause, and that sometimes the most honest creations are the ones we do not rush to understand. It was not an answer, but a shape, not a tool, but a gesture. And in the soft rhythm of that year, where everything held still, the Almost Invention fit perfectly, a question posed gently into a sky with no urgency to reply. Of the value in beginning something, even if it never reached conclusion. School children were told the story of the man who made a thing without needing to explain it. Artists came to sketch its curves. One composer wrote a piece titled Unfinished Silence, inspired by its presence, a collection of quiet notes played between long pauses. He never invited anyone in, but neither did he close the door. For several days, Tolan left it alone, glancing at it now and then with the same curiosity one might offer a forgotten word on the tip of the tongue. It seemed familiar and unknowable at once, like a memory from a dream you never had. On the fourth day, he picked it up, turned it over in his hand, and then gently placed it inside a wooden box lined with linen. He closed the lid and wrote a note on the outside. Perhaps next year. The act of making, he believed, did not require audience, only attention. And attention, that year, was in great supply. With little else to demand urgency, Tolan found himself able to think slowly, to build without the pressure of a deadline. Tolan believed that invention was mostly about listening, not to people, but to things. He claimed that if you left an object alone long enough, it would tell you what it wanted to become. He had woken before dawn with a vague sense of instruction in his mind, a shape, or perhaps a motion, hovering just beneath waking thought. The calendar page bearing the original sketch remained pinned to the wall, curling slightly at the edges. Occasionally, someone would ask Tolan if he had finished his invention. He would nod slowly and say, "Almost." They accepted the answer without question. In a year where nothing urgent knocked on the door, the unfinished felt as natural as the unspoken. The village seemed to understand, in its own quiet way, that not every thought must become a thing. He gathered materials, a length of twine, a smooth stone, a broken clock hand, a piece of glass from an old lantern. He shaved wood into gentle curves, coiled copper wire around nails, and carved a base from cedar that smelled like warmth even in the chill of morning. The invention began to take shape, not as a whole, but as a kind of rhythm. It did not resemble anything known, but it balanced in the palm, and that seemed enough. He rose quietly, lit a small lamp, and began sketching with charcoal on the back of a discarded calendar. The drawing was unclear. It resembled neither tool nor toy, neither instrument nor engine. But Toland felt it meant something. He did not know what it would do, only that it wanted to be. A cracked teacup, he once said, whispered of becoming a bird feeder. A squeaky floorboard beneath his workbench had dreams of music. His shed was more museum than workshop, a place where items waited not to be fixed, but to be imagined differently. Nothing was thrown away, nothing truly finished. Everything held the shimmer of possible purpose. In the spring of 1732, Toland began to work on something he could not name. For weeks, he returned to the diagram, adding small notations and measurements based more on feeling than fact. Villagers occasionally passed by his shed, noting the soft tapping sounds, the low hum of sanding, the click of assembled pieces. One afternoon in late summer, he set the final piece into place, a curved strip of tin that rested like a question mark against the frame. The object offered no reply. It did not disappoint him. It did not inspire him. It simply remained. And that was that. The object was not displayed, not discussed. Years later, long after Toland had left the world in the same quiet way he had lived, the shed was emptied. Visitors looked at it the way they might look at a horizon, not for what was there, but for what might be. In a world often obsessed with outcomes, the almost invention reminded those who passed by that meaning does not always demand utility. In the quiet countryside where one meadow leaned gently into another, there existed two villages that were so close they could hear each other's church bells on a still morning. Village A and Village B. The names had long since lost their original meaning. No significant foot traffic, no carts or carriages, no accidents or discoveries. Grass grew at its edges without hurry. Pebbles settled into soft arrangements. The wind passed over it without disturbance. But in early September of that year, something gently uncommon happened. Each step revealed small details. A patch of moss clinging to stone, a snail crossing in silent determination. As they passed, each became aware of the other's pace, the way their feet met the earth, the way they carried themselves. The man noticed the ribbon tied to the woman's basket. She sat beneath a tree, feeling the bark against her back and the earth beneath her palms. They noticed stones they hadn't on the way there. The rhythm of their steps adjusted naturally. When they reached their homes, the sky had begun to soften into its evening hue. Fires were being lit. Doors clicked shut. Chickens cooed their dusk-time murmurs. Nothing had changed, and yet something had been acknowledged. A movement had occurred within a year where most things stayed still. She closed her eyes and listened. The wind sounded exactly as it did at home. The bells rang at the same hour. The man recorded 10 pages of notes. Most of them were about footsteps. He noted the length of stride, the shape of impressions left in dirt, and the subtle difference in how his boots sounded on gravel compared to soil. The woman sketched the path in 4 panels, each labeled only by time: morning, noon, afternoon, and evening. Her drawings included no people, just light, shadow, and hedgerows. Neither of them mentioned meeting the other. That, perhaps, had become part of the path itself. Yet the simple act of sitting elsewhere gave her the sensation of pause, like standing slightly outside her own life for a moment. Children were told the story of the journey between A and B, and back again, as an example of something small done with great intention. It bore no plaque, no name, just smooth wood and a view of both directions. People began to stop there, not to rest, but to listen. To the wind, the birds, the rhythm of their own breathing. It became a place of reflection, of noticing, of remembering that distance is not measured only in miles, but in presence, and that the most meaningful journeys are not always the ones that carry us far, but the ones that allow us to be fully where we are. It was not a pilgrimage. It was not a quest. It was simply a walk A moment where people moved gently through the stillness and noticed more than they had before. The story made its way into school books as a lesson in quiet observation, titled simply, "The Longest Short Journey." She did not stay long, just long enough to feel the stillness from a new direction. The woman saw the careful way the man stepped around a stone rather than over it. Then they continued in opposite directions, each now subtly aware of having shared something wordless, a coincidence so soft it barely qualified as one. The sun filtered through hedges in long golden strips, casting shadows that shifted just slightly with each passing hour. Birds did not sing, but they rustled in branches. The walkers did not meet halfway, but passed each other about 3/4 of the way through. A silent nod, exchanged between two strangers engaged in the same gentle act of motion. Two villagers, one from village A, one from village B, decided, independently and without purpose, to walk the path. Their names were not recorded. What mattered was not who they were, but how they walked. He sat on a bench near the well and watched the way the villagers moved, no differently than his own neighbors, yet somehow just distinct enough to feel new. A dog walked by with a lazy confidence. A boy carried a bundle of herbs. Somewhere nearby, a pot clinked against a table. He ate his bread slowly, then filled his cup at the well. The water tasted just like the water from his own village. And still, it felt worth the walk. No one remembered who came first, or whether the letters signified anything at all. The road between them was short, a little over 1 kilometer, and perfectly straight, bordered on each side by rows of hedges and sleepy dandelions. She had always looked at the path as something for others. She had no business in village, yet that morning it looked a little like an invitation, not urgent, not demanding, but gentle and open. She wiped her hands on her apron, tied her scarf, and set out. No particular reason, just a sense that a walk, even a short one, might feel right on such a still day. It was not a path of pilgrimage, nor a thoroughfare of commerce. It was simply a path. For most of the year 1732, the path remained unchanged, as everything else did. The man from village A rose early that day. He felt a restlessness he could not explain. It wasn't unhappiness nor curiosity. It was more like a shift in balance, as if staying put had begun to feel slightly more unnatural than moving. He packed a small satchel with bread and water, fastened his cloak, and stepped outside. The air was mild, the kind of temperature that asks nothing of the body. He turned toward the narrow road and began walking with the rhythm of someone neither in a rush or wandering. Just forward, steady, step by step. At nearly the same time, the woman from village B had finished feeding her hens and found herself standing at her garden gate, staring toward the horizon. The road between the villages, though short, seemed longer when walked slowly. Neither spoke. There was no need. The act of walking was, in itself, a kind of conversation. The man reached village B in the early afternoon. He did not announce himself. Meanwhile, the woman from village B arrived at village A and found herself drawn to the small grove near the chapel. Both returned the same day. Neither rushed. The walk back felt different, not heavier, not longer, just more familiar. Later that month, both wrote about the walk in their personal journals. In time, their respective villages came to hear of the two walks, not as events, but as curiosities. A bench was later placed halfway between the two villages, near where the walkers had passed one another. In the town square of Nornley, where the cobblestones met in patterns few ever paused to trace, a curious notice was pinned one morning to the oak board beside the bakery. The parchment was aged, not by time but by design, with careful calligraphy inked in dark brown. A contest, they mused, was rare in itself. But a contest of rest? That was something different altogether. Questions formed like steam on glass. Would one have to sleep publicly? Was it possible to win simply by being still? And most pressingly, who would stay awake long enough to declare the winner? Participants gathered in the green field near the pond, each bringing what they needed to settle in. Some sat cross-legged, others reclined in carts, chewing slowly on slices of pear or small wheels of cheese. People lay still, their chests rising and falling in unison, some curled like commas, others stretched like long vowels. A dog wandered through, sniffed a few toes, then curled up in a sunspot and joined the endeavor. But no one moved. There was no winner to announce, no finish line to cross. He walked to the center of the field and held up the original parchment. After a long pause, he declared that the winner of the first annual contest of rest was the one who had slept so deeply they could not be woken to accept the prize. A small cheer was attempted, but most opted instead for a series of appreciative nods. The winner was gently covered with a shawl. A note was placed beside them. "You have embodied the spirit of 1732. The townspeople remained where they were, drifting somewhere between rest and waking. The sun dipped behind the hill. Lanterns were lit, casting a golden glow over the field. The soft light made the sleeping figures look like statues of peace. A sense of reverence hung in the air, as if everyone understood they were part of something quietly profound. Occasionally someone shifted, scratched their nose, or sighed. But there was no applause, no commentary, just the patient silence of shared repose. Even the bees moved more slowly than usual, hovering near flowers, but rarely landing. People spoke not of who had participated, but of how it had felt. Not to compete, but to remember, to rest, to honor the year that taught them the value of slowing so deeply that time itself seemed to nap. Elders told children of the event, not with excitement, but with a soft smile and a long pause. And somewhere, still folded beneath a woolen shawl in a quiet house, the original parchment rests, unframed, uncreased, as if it too is sleeping, waiting for the next invitation to be heard not as a command, but as a lullaby. They described the texture of the grass beneath them, the softness of the sky, the quiet companionship of shared silence. It had not been a test, they said, but a moment, a rare alignment of mood, weather, and willingness. Some remarked how they had never felt more awake than in the moments just before falling asleep. A few began to doze off themselves. Children whispered for a while, then mimicked the adults and lay down in the grass. Birds, perhaps sensing the tone of the day, chirped only once and then fell respectfully quiet. Even the usual creak of the windmill on the hill paused for a moment, as if to listen. The town clock struck 10. A gentle bell rang. The contest had begun. There were woven mats, bundled quilts, cushions stuffed with dried lavender, and even one feather bed carried out in a wheelbarrow by 3 siblings. One family constructed a small canopy from their laundry line and old curtains, which billowed gently in the breeze. No one seemed to mind the lack of rules. In fact, it seemed to relax them further. It read simply, "The first annual contest of rest. All are welcome. Prizes not specified. Judging criteria unclear." It seemed less like a call to competition than a reminder of something people had forgotten they knew. To rest was no longer merely recovery. In this quiet year of 1732, it had become an art. The only movement came from the slow swaying of trees and the occasional snore. An elderly man under a blue umbrella seemed to levitate slightly from the ground with each breath, a rising and falling that mesmerized a nearby onlooker into her own slumber. At one point, a squirrel dropped a small acorn beside a sleeping contestant. The contestant did not stir, and the squirrel appeared impressed. In the margins of the day, stillness bloomed. Word spread beyond the town, not with urgency, but with the same measured pace that news of ripening pears or a perfectly balanced pie crust might carry. And beneath that, a single date, October 8, 1732. There was no signature, no seal, no organization named. Instead, the townspeople chose blankets, fluffed pillows, and aired out the old hammocks left from warmer months. Some practiced napping in different spots around town to find the best ambient sounds. The smith's apprentice, after much experimentation, declared that the shade behind the bell tower held the perfect balance of breeze and quiet. Others swore by the corner beneath the clockmaker's window, where time seemed to tick more softly. Just an invitation, as though the air itself had requested it. The townspeople gathered around with a kind of slow, wondering attention usually reserved for unusual clouds or new kinds of soup. As the days passed, more copies of the notice appeared, some neatly posted, others tucked under doors or slipped into baskets of apples. Preparations began, though in the gentlest of ways. No booths were built, no stages erected. When October 8th arrived, the morning was soft with mist, and the sun rose slowly, as though reluctant to disturb the stillness. Observers, if they could be called that, took up spots around the field, more out of curiosity than judgment. For the next several hours, the field resembled a painting rather than an event. By afternoon, the mist had lifted, and the warmth of the sun wrapped around the sleepers like a second blanket. As dusk approached, a gentle bell rang again, this time signaling the close of the contest. Eventually, the mayor stood and cleared his throat quietly, though even that seemed a touch loud. In the days that followed, the contest was discussed with a kind of reverence, usually reserved for eclipses or the sudden blooming of rare flowers. Years later, the field was renamed the Meadow of Stillness. No plaque was placed, no monument built, but every October 8th, people returned. There were, in the quiet folds of that quiet year, many things that passed unspoken, not out of secrecy, but out of the sheer absence of occasion. Even words, once proud of their function, had begun to lounge about, unused and unhurried. It was in this soft climate of silence that a certain letter came to be written, a letter unlike any other, and yet utterly empty. It was said to have been written by a man named Ellery Capps, a retired record keeper who lived at the edge of the village, in a house that smelled faintly of chalk and dry ink. Ellery had once documented everything from wheat tallies to the annual number of new buttons sewn onto the vicar's cassocks. But in 1732, he found himself with nothing new to record. So he did the next natural thing. He began to write a letter about it. Began, as most letters did, with a date and a salutation. And then, line after line, Ellery continued to write. He filled the page with soft loops and steady lines, each neatly spaced and inked with the precision of long habit. But there were no words, not really. Just the occasional swirl, the kind a pen makes when it's thinking, and a rhythmic line that stretched, paused, then began again. 500 lines he wrote, not one sentence, not a single noun, verb, or thought spelled out in full. It was, as he later told no one, a conversation I had with stillness. When the letter was finished, Ellery folded it once, sealed it with plain wax, and addressed it to an old friend who lived 2 villages away. The postman, upon receiving it, held the letter up to the light, blinked, and shrugged. He delivered it the next morning, humming a forgotten lullaby under his breath as he walked toward the recipient. A woman named Agatha Meyer opened it with care. She had known Ellery for decades, though they hadn't exchanged correspondence in years. She read the letter slowly, line by line, watching the ink trail across the paper like footsteps across a snow-covered field. When she reached the end, she did not feel puzzled. She felt understood. There was a familiarity in the emptiness, as though someone had written down her own quiet. She folded the letter back and placed it in a wooden box that smelled of lavender and kept it beside her bed. Visitors who saw it sometimes asked what the letter said. Agatha would smile and answer, Exactly what I needed to hear. Word of the letter drifted through the village with the soft persistence of kettle steam. Some laughed. Others felt something, close to awe. The letter, without trying, had become famous. Not for its content, but for its lack thereof. It became a kind of mirror, reflecting each reader's quiet longing. One elder remarked that it reminded him of the sound the hearth makes just before it goes cold. A baker whispered that it made her think of bread rising at dawn, quiet and unseen. A local curator borrowed it for display in the Museum of Things That Almost Happened. It sat beneath a glass dome, resting on pale linen. The label read, "Letter of 500 lines with nothing to say, circa 1732. Possibly the quietest correspondence ever sent." Visitors came, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs. They stood before the letter and read its blankness in full. Some closed their eyes afterward, as if to absorb the meaning better. One schoolchild reportedly burst into tears, saying only, "It made me feel like a thought." A poet visited and left behind a single line in the guest book. "This letter spoke louder than most of my life." The museum, otherwise modest in foot traffic, experienced a brief swell, but it never became crowded. Somehow, even its newfound fame remained gentle. Quiet conversations bloomed like low mist in the gallery. People lingered longer in the silence after seeing it, reluctant to disturb whatever the letter had stirred. Some brought notebooks, not to sketch or quote, but to practice the soft art of filling a page without speaking. Some began writing similar letters pages of gentle loops, inked rhythms, and the spaces between intentions. They called them hollow letters or thought scrolls. They were never sent, only folded and kept in drawers, pressed between volumes, or sewn into the linings of coats. One man reportedly buried his in a teacup beneath a sycamore tree, believing it would sprout anew. Kind of silence. A young woman copied hers on a quilt square, stitching ink into fabric dot in small corners of the world. Inspired by Ellery's creation, these quiet missives became acts of shared solitude. They were left in birdhouses, slipped into hollow stones, and placed beneath pillows before sleep. Some were given as gifts without context, received in silence, and treasured just the same. They offered something few other gestures could, space to breathe within. Years later, after Agatha had passed and the museum had been converted into a quiet tea room, the letter was returned to Ellery's descendants. They placed it back into its envelope and set it on a shelf, next to a vase of dried lavender and a stack of unfinished puzzles. Occasionally, one of them would remove it, unfold it carefully, and gaze for a long time. They would nod to themselves and fold it again without a word, and so the letter remained, unread but never forgotten. Its pages yellowed slowly, its ink faded softly, but it held its place in memory, a gentle monument to the kind of year when saying nothing was, at last saying everything. In a town where records had once been made with precision and pride, it became the most remembered letter of all, not for what it said, but for what it allowed others to feel. In that blankness, people found company. In those silent lines, a rhythm that matched the quiet thrum of 1732, and in that, perhaps, lay the truest message ever sent. A lull in the noise, a deep sigh on paper, a sentence written with nothing but breath. In a garden not far from the heart of the village, surrounded by hedges trimmed with a care only boredom can sustain, stood a tree of no great distinction. Its trunk was modest, its bark unremarkable, and its leaves were of the usual green. Yet, this tree, an old apple-bearer planted by someone no longer remembered, became the stage for one of the most documented non-events of the entire year. The apple in question hung from a low branch, round and smooth, with a sheen that caught the early autumn light. For months it had remained there, ripening without haste, shifting ever so gently in the breeze. Gardeners passed beneath it, birds ignored it, and the cat that slept near its roots never once looked up. And then, on a morning so still it felt, patted, the apple detached dot, it did not drop with urgency. It let go slowly, as if changing its mind halfway through the fall. It spun once, perhaps twice, and descended through the air like a sigh. When it touched the ground, it did not bruise. It bounced, that was all, and yet it was not nothing. The bounce was delicate, nearly imperceptible, but it happened. The apple rose perhaps the height of a thimble, turned slightly, and settled. With a small roll into the grass, a moment was witnessed by a passer-by, an elderly man known for timing his morning walk with the church bell. He stopped mid-step and gazed at the apple for several minutes before sitting on a nearby bench. Later, he would tell his niece it was the most gentle expression of gravity he had ever seen. Word traveled slowly, as it always did. By midday, 3 others had come to see the apple. One brought a magnifying glass. Another brought a sketchbook. The third brought a loaf of bread and sat quietly nearby, eating while she observed. The apple remained where it had landed. No one dared move it. Children were brought to see it, and though they expected excitement, they found something quieter, more curious. They asked if it had truly bounced, and the adults nodded, but always with a soft finger to the lips. By the third day, someone placed a small sign near it, "Please do not disturb." This apple has completed its journey, scholars took note. A local physicist visited and murmured appreciatively, noting the consistency of the soil and the slope of the garden. She declared it an anomaly of softness, a harmony between fruit and earth so rare it had likely passed unremarked for centuries. Soon, a stool was placed beside the tree for those who wished to sit and watch. Nothing more happened. The tree remained still, the grass unchanging, the apple resting precisely where it had bounced. And yet, the visits continued. Some began to meditate there. Others brought journals, not to write about the apple exactly, but to sit near it and remember how slowly things can fall. One woman claimed that after seeing the apple, she no longer rushed her tea. A watercolor artist painted the scene 6 times, each image nearly identical. When asked why, she said she was trying to capture the part of the moment that couldn't be seen. A poet wrote a verse where every line ended in the word almost. Another composed an ode without verbs. The village, already lulled by the year's gentle rhythms, took the event in stride. Bakers began shaping rolls to resemble the apple's curve. A cobbler crafted a shoe with a sole that, when pressed, mimicked a bounce. The local tailor added a lining to winter cloaks described as apple soft. A philosophy group formed briefly, calling themselves the Gentle Fall Society. They met under the tree and spoke in whispers about inevitability, softness, and the importance of yielding. Their minutes, fittingly, were blank sheets, with only the date and the word present. Poets wrote verses with wide spaces between lines. Musicians composed single-note melodies, stretched over several minutes. A carpenter designed a rocking chair, inspired by the arc of the apple's bounce. One young apprentice said it made him dream more slowly. All of this stemming from one quiet descent. When winter approached, the apple, now gently dimpled by time, was carefully moved by gloved hands. It was placed on a velvet cushion inside the village hall. A brass plaque was installed beside it, reading, "The Apple That Bounced. October, 1732. A moment of perfect softness." Visitors were asked not to speak above a whisper in its presence. Some removed their shoes. Others lit small candles, not in reverence, but simply to add to the hush. A child pressed their ear to the glass case and claimed to hear the sound of leaves breathing. And as snow dusted the rooftops, more came to see the apple that had not fallen hard. Children born years later would hear about it in lullabies. Soft fell the apple, soft came the night, sang one mother as she rocked her baby. The line passed from memory into tradition, as all quiet things eventually do. It became embroidered on blankets, carved into headboards, whispered in church pews, and so it endured, not as a spectacle, but as a moment folded neatly into time. The apple's bounce became a symbol of the year when everything happened so gently. It was almost missed. It became the measure of gentleness for an entire generation. When two friends met and felt no need to speak, they would say, "It was an apple day." In the stillness of the present, if you listen just right, you might hear the echo of that soft landing. Not loud, not remarkable, just enough to remind you that sometimes the smallest touch can leave the longest impression. It was never about the apple, not really. It was about what it meant to fall and rise again, even if only slightly, to yield with grace, to land with care, to take up just enough space to be noticed, but never enough to disturb. It was, in the softest way, a lesson in how to simply be. On the quieter end of the village, where fences leaned gently and weeds were regarded as guests, there lived a man named Horace Linley. He was known, if at all, for two things: his poor eyesight and his deep thoughts. Horace was a philosopher, by inclination rather than profession, and though his spectacles were thick and perpetually smudged, he believed himself to see more clearly than most. Horace had once tried to teach philosophy at a small school, but the children were more interested in catching butterflies than contemplating being, so he retired early, taking up residence in a cottage whose windows overlooked a field that was never plowed and a road that rarely hosted more than a passing cart. It was the perfect setting for a man who preferred to think slowly. In 1732, while others remarked on the nothingness of the year, Horace felt a peculiar satisfaction. For him, this was not an absence of meaning, but an invitation to observe. He wandered daily from his cottage to a bench near a pond that reflected only clouds and time. There he would sit for hours, staring not at the surface, but at what it made him feel. He began writing a book that year, though no one knew it. The manuscript had no title, no table of contents, and only one sentence repeated at irregular intervals. Perhaps the stillness is not empty, but full of everything waiting. Visitors who came to the village sometimes met Horace by chance. They would find him peering at a blade of grass or listening to the way a fence creaked in windless weather. He was not eccentric in the usual sense. He simply paid attention to things most people never paused for. One merchant, passing through, said he found Horace in the act of timing how long a shadow took to move across a single stone. Horace's near blindness did not trouble him. If anything, it clarified his world. Without distractions of detail, he claimed to see the essence of things. A tree was not just bark and branch, but persistence. A cloud was not moisture, but mood. A paused conversation became, to him, a symphony of restraint. He said silence was a form of music that only the slow-hearted could hear. By mid-year, Horace had taken to holding silent gatherings on his porch. He called them sessions of unspoken thought. Villagers would arrive, sit with tea, and watch the sky. No one was asked to share, yet people often left feeling they had spoken volumes. A local butcher described it as the first time he had ever felt fully listened to, even though no words were exchanged. News of Horace's quiet gatherings spread to nearby villages. A few curious thinkers and wandering students began to visit. They left behind small notes on scraps of paper, questions, reflections, sometimes only a drawing of a line. Horace kept them all in a drawer labeled Echoes. Some read like riddles, others like dreams. But they all shared one thing in common: no urgency. One afternoon in late August, a scholar arrived unannounced. He wore polished boots and carried a stack of parchment. Expecting discourse, he found instead a shared silence and a man nodding at the rustle of leaves. He left confused but oddly calmed, his papers untouched. He later wrote that he had never felt so unchallenged, and yet so moved. Horace never published his book, though he finished it. Its pages were filled with phrases that hovered between clarity and dream. He coined terms no one understood, but somehow accepted: the gravity of pause, the philosophy of almost, the distance between two thoughts that never meet. He used metaphors like shadows lying down and wind forgetting where it had blown. When asked, many in the village could not say what Horace believed, but they all agreed on one thing: he made them feel like their quiet lives were worthy of attention. Children brought him small pebbles and asked him what he thought they meant. He never gave the same answer twice. To one, the pebble meant patience. To another, wait. To a third, a reminder that some things are meant to stay still. On the first morning of winter, Horace walked slower than usual. He paused beneath a tree where frost had traced lace onto every branch. There, he whispered something that no one heard. He smiled, nodded at nothing in particular, and turned back toward home. He said the day felt like a folded thought. That same day, he placed the final page of his manuscript inside a wooden box. On the cover, in ink that had faded to a faint gray, he wrote the title, The Profoundness of Absolutely Nothing. Some thought it a joke. Others thought it a riddle. But Horace meant every word. The book was not about emptiness, but about what happens when you stop trying to fill every moment. It was a celebration of the in-between, of pauses and patience, and the vast plain of unremarkable time. After Horace passed quietly in his sleep many years later, the book was discovered by his niece, who thought it was a diary. She read it slowly, sometimes aloud, and though she didn't always understand it, she wept at certain lines without knowing why. She said it felt like someone had described the way her thoughts moved when she couldn't sleep. The manuscript was eventually placed in the same museum that had once displayed the famous silent letter. It sat in a glass case beneath soft lighting. Visitors rarely stayed long with it, but some returned multiple times, claiming the book changed each time they read it. A few copied passages onto napkins, bookmarks, or their own arms. Artists borrowed its phrases for titles. Musicians set its rhythm to metronomes that never moved. And philosophers, at last, declared it the only treatise that made them feel, rather than think. The near-blind philosopher had, in his own dim way, seen more than most. Not the world as it was, but as it might be if viewed through quiet eyes. And in that year, when everything stood still, he gave the stillness shape. It is said that if you visit his old cottage now, you can still find his bench by the pond. Wood is warm, and the pond reflects nothing but sky. But if you sit long enough, you may feel the press of thoughts not your own. You may hear the hush between ideas. You may feel the weight of the unspoken. And if you're lucky, you might whisper. As he once did, perhaps the stillness is not empty, but full of everything waiting. Each year in the village, there had been festivals. Small ones, mostly, filled with pies and music, children running, and adults pretending not to worry about the weather. But in 1732, as the calendar grew thick with empty squares and the world grew quiet, the people decided to celebrate something different. Or rather, they chose to celebrate the absence of everything. It began, as these things often do, with a half-thought murmured over tea. A woman named Mabel, who kept bees and rarely raised her voice, said aloud to no one in particular, "Perhaps we should mark the occasion of nothing at all." Those nearby blinked. A few nodded. And then, over the course of a week, a plan began to form, slowly, softly, like mist collecting on windows. It would not be a loud celebration. They agreed. There would be no speeches, no fireworks, and no fanfare. It would be a festival in name only, a gesture, a shared silence held together by gentle ritual. The chosen day was a Tuesday because it felt suitably unremarkable. Invitations were never printed, only suggested through casual mentions. If you're free on the 14th, perhaps join us. That sort of thing. Nothing urgent. No pressure. Only presence. On the morning of the festival, the village square was cleared of its usual clutter. No carts, no banners. Just open space and quiet intention. People arrived without ceremony, each dressed as they normally were, though some wore softer fabrics and slower smiles. A gentle breeze moved through the square. Almost unnoticed, a long table had been set out, not for eating, but simply to hold empty bowls. Each was labeled with a different word: stillness, pause, almost, waiting. One was labeled later and had a note beneath it that read, perhaps tomorrow. Children, instructed gently, walked rather than ran. They held hands or sat together under a sycamore tree, tracing shapes into the soil. One boy fell asleep on a patch of moss and was covered with a borrowed scarf. Another child stared at a drifting cloud for over an hour, whispering that it looked like a forgotten yawn dot at noon. A slow gesture was performed. One by one, villagers stepped forward and placed something unremarkable on a central cloth. A stone, a feather, a dried petal, a folded piece of paper with no writing. Each object rested beside the next without order or hierarchy. It became a museum of the unnoticed. There was no judging, no commentary, just the quiet hum of shared stillness that no one spoke during the placing. The silence was not enforced, but invited. It had a kind of softness that allowed sound to dissolve before becoming noise. A bird chirped nearby and was greeted by a smile. Even the breeze seemed to quiet itself as the ritual continued. Later in the afternoon, a dance was performed, but not in the usual way. 3 women and 2 men stood in a loose circle, then slowly turned in place. Their arms moved as if brushing invisible threads. Their steps were so subtle, it was hard to say if they were moving at all. Children watching assumed it was a game. Older villagers watched with wet eyes, not quite understanding why. A melody was played on a single flute, very slowly, one note drawn out until it vanished. Then another. It filled the space between breeze and breath. People said it felt like remembering something you hadn't known you'd forgotten. A few closed their eyes and simply listened, their hands resting on their knees. As the sun dipped lower, tea was served, not with pastries or conversation, but in quiet companionship. Each person received a cup and chose where to sit: on a bench, beneath a tree, beside someone, or alone. The tea was warm and floral, and no one asked what was in it. A cat curled up under the table and slept through it all. Someone placed a handbell on the table, but did not ring it. It sat there as a possibility, not a command. A reminder that sound was always nearby, but not always necessary. It gleamed softly in the golden light, untouched yet somehow heard. The final act of the day was a collective pause. At an agreed-upon moment, everyone in the square stood still for a full minute. No motion, no gesture, just shared presence. It was not dramatic, but it lingered. Some said they could feel the minute stretch like fabric pulled gently. When the minute ended, no one clapped. A few smiled. Some exhaled. Then, without ceremony, people began to drift away. A few stayed behind to collect the objects and place them gently into a box labeled nothing in particular. A child carried the box with great care, as if it held dreams. By the next day, the square had returned to its usual quiet. But something felt different. The benches seemed more patient. The trees looked more deliberate, and people greeted each other with slower nods and softer eyes. Even the dogs barked less. The festival of nothing happening became a yearly tradition. But it never grew larger. It never changed much. It did not seek improvement. It simply returned like a familiar silence, like the weight of a hand resting gently on your shoulder. It was not something to be anticipated, only remembered in later years. Visitors would sometimes stumble upon the festival by accident. They would ask what it was for. No one ever gave the same answer. Some said it was to remember what peace felt like. Others said it was for listening. A child once said, "It's where the quiet goes to rest." Another visitor described it as the first time they had ever been part of something that asked nothing from them. And in that village, in that unremarkable year, the festival of nothing happening stood as a reminder that presence does not always need purpose. That silence, when shared, becomes something more than absence. It becomes a shape, a shelter, a celebration. When the museum curator, years later, curated an exhibit on the year 1732, she gave one room to the festival. It held the empty bowls, the untouched bell, the cloth with its ordinary treasures. A recording of the single-note melody played once every hour, very quietly. Visitors often lingered there, their footsteps soft on the wooden floor. Visitors would often pause there longer than anywhere else. Some left without speaking. Others jotted down a single word in the guest book. Many simply stood and breathed, letting the hush settle around them like a second skin. And long after the festival had ended, the echo of it remained. In slower footsteps, in longer glances, in the way people sometimes reached for each other without needing to speak. A celebration of the invisible, remembered not for what happened, but for what didn't. It was, in every way, enough. In the quietest cottage on the edge of the village, tucked between two slow-growing willow trees, lived an old cat named Whimsy. She belonged to no one in particular and everyone at once. Over the years, she had been fed by bakers, carried by children, and spoken to softly by those who preferred animals to people. By the start of 1732, Whimsy had grown old enough that even the birds stopped bothering with her. Her coat had faded from gray to nearly white, and her days were spent entirely in one long and deliberate motion. Stillness. Whimsy chose a spot beneath the sunniest window in the carpenter's shop and remained there, not just for an afternoon or a week, but for what would become merely the entire year. At first, the carpenter thought it an amusing work. He tiptoed around her, adjusted her blanket, and once built her a small wooden ramp so she wouldn't have to jump to the windowsill. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, it became clear that Whimsy had made a decision. She would not be moved. She would not leave. Her life had shifted from motion to meditation, from chasing things to contemplating them from afar. A still figure in a world already slowing down. Each morning, villagers would peek in to see if she was still there. And each morning, they would find her exactly as she had been, eyes half closed, paws tucked beneath her, the rhythm of her breathing the only sign that she remained among them. She did not purr. She did not twitch. She simply was. Children began to refer to her as the thoughtful cloud, and old men nodded in agreement, noting that her presence had become a sort of anchor in the gentle drift of time. Poems were written about her unchanging posture. One boy insisted she had discovered the true meaning of life and was now in a state of perfect contemplation. A woman swore that sitting beside Whimsy had helped her fall asleep after 3 months of restless nights. People began to bring her gifts. Not food, for she hardly ate, but symbols. A glass marble, a folded note with no writing, a feather shaped like a question mark. All were placed gently beside her, forming a quiet shrine to endurance and ease. No one ever took the objects away. Over time, They formed a soft ring around her, like punctuation around a sacred sentence. Whimsy, of course, never acknowledged these offerings. Nor did she acknowledge the whispers or the stories or the occasional sketch artist who tried to capture her stillness on paper. She simply continued to breathe, and in doing so, became something more than a cat dot in late summer. A visiting philosopher came to the village and heard whispers of the unmoving feline. Curious, he entered the carpenter's shop and sat beside her for hours. He left with nothing written, only a changed expression. Later, he told someone in passing that he had been in the presence of perfect surrender. The seasons moved around Whimsy. Autumn leaves drifted past the window and were swept away. Snow fell and melted and fell again. The wind howled some nights, but the carpenter's shop held firm, and Whimsy remained at peace in her chosen spot. She did not shiver. She did not stir. By December, she had become a village fixture. Travelers would ask for directions not to landmarks or inns, but to the cat who had done nothing for so long. She inspired slow walks and long sighs. One woman began painting her dreams after sitting quietly in Whimsy's presence. Another claimed to have heard a distant tune while watching her breathe, though no instrument had played Dot. And then, one day, as the final week of the year unfolded like a soft blanket, something shifted. The carpenter entered his shop as usual and paused. Whimsy's posture was the same. Her body, light as memory, still rested by the window. But the rise and fall of her breath had stilled. The news spread gently, without alarm. People came quietly, not to mourn, but to sit. The ring of objects remained untouched. No one dared to move her. Instead, someone laid a folded cloth across her back, as if tucking her in for the last night. A child drew a picture of her and taped it to the wall above her resting place. A soft tribute in colored pencil. A local sculptor, moved by her devotion to stillness, carved a statue in her likeness. It was placed not in the village square, but beside the very window where she had spent her final year. The statue captured her exactly as she had been. Eyes half-lidded, body composed, and face turned slightly toward the fading light. Beneath the sculpture was a simple plaque that read, "Whimsy, the one who remained." Villagers would sometimes pause their tea in hand and sit quietly for a moment. Children still told stories about her. Some claimed she had not died at all, only chosen to blend into the air. Others said she had become the spirit of the quiet year itself. No one argued. She appeared in lullabies, in local games, even in embroidery. Her image was stitched into shawls and etched into spoon handles. Whimsy had become part of the fabric of 1732, a figure of peaceful inertia. And so, in a year where everything seemed to wait, to linger, to unfold at the pace of moss on stone, Whimsy became its gentle emblem, not for action, not for change, but for being, simply being. She did not need to move to be remembered. Some said she had mastered the art of not doing, that she had shown what it meant to be at rest with the world. And long after she was gone, the soft imprint of her presence remained, on a sun-warmed floor, in the hush between words, in the knowing that sometimes the most profound thing one can do is nothing at all. She was, and that was enough. In the hush that followed Whimsy's long stillness, the year continued its slow descent toward completion. December wore itself down like a soft pencil, each day rubbing gently against the edge of time. The village calendar, pinned beside the bakery's rear door, still bore the markings of earlier month-smudged notes about market days. A doodle of a duck in April, a small stain that looked suspiciously like jam got. It was a modest calendar, with 12 thick pages, each one slightly more curled than the last. The final page was December, adorned with faded holly and a gentle blue border. No one had circled any days. There were no birthdays or holidays marked, only the pale gray numbers laid out in neat rows. Quiet and unremarkable dot as the final week of the year arrived. No great celebration stirred. There was no town crier, no bell tolling to count down the hours. People moved through the days much as they had all year, with care, with quiet routines, with a kind of respectful monotony. The baker kneaded the same soft dough. The tailor mended the same tear in a pair of trousers that had never quite needed mending. The weather remained agreeably unchanged dot in homes lit with gentle oil lamps. Conversations took place in low tones. Meals were shared with the same steady cadence as the months before. There was no rush, no planning for grand beginnings. A few families sat by their fireplaces and recalled what little had happened during the year, often pausing for long silences that seemed to say more than words could. And then, one morning, it happened. Without fanfare or expectation, the last square on the calendar was reached. The page for December 31st came and went. No one marked it. No one drew a line through it. It was simply lived like any other day. The sun rose, warmed the windows, then faded. The sky turned a pale grayish blue, identical to the evening before. The following morning, January began. But again, no one rushed to greet it. It arrived as softly as a sigh. A small breeze drifted through the square. A few birds fluttered near the well. Somewhere, a cat yawned. A sheep bleated. A curtain moved slightly in a window, as if waving gently toward the new calendar that had not yet been hung dot. It wasn't until late afternoon that someone noticed the calendar had not been updated. A boy sank to fetch flour from the bakery, glanced at the wall and blinked. He stared at the page for December, now technically out of date, and tilted his head. Quietly, he tore the page from the hook. The sound it made was delicate, like the turning of a dry leaf. No one inside the bakery paused. The boy held the page in both hands, stared at it a moment longer, then folded it into fourths and tucked it into his coat pocket. He didn't know why he kept it. Perhaps it felt wrong to throw it away. Perhaps it was the way the edges had curled, or the faint scent of yeast it had absorbed over the months. Or perhaps, deep down, he felt he was holding something more than paper. A moment crystallized in its simplest form dot. As he stepped outside, he passed an elderly man sitting on the bakery stoop. The man looked up, squinted at the sky, and asked, without urgency, "Did the year end, then?" The boy nodded. The man blinked slowly. "Strange," he said. "I didn't notice." The boy nodded again, and for a while they sat and shared. Stillness. No great insights followed, no exclamations. Just a slow realization that something had shifted barely. A faint movement in the fabric of the days. Elsewhere in the village, others began to notice the absence. A shopkeeper found that her ledgers had no more blank pages. A schoolteacher looked at the blackboard and saw a date from the previous year still written in chalk. A clockmaker, polishing a gear, paused midwipe and thought vaguely that he had meant to change something, but could not remember what. Still, life moved gently forward. The sun's arc across the sky changed by only a fraction. The ducks in the pond quacked with no more or less enthusiasm. The familiar sounds of sweeping and stirring continued, and the new year slipped in beneath their feet like an extra breath they hadn't realized they'd taken. Eventually, the boy who had taken the final page did something unexpected. One afternoon, while walking past the village museum, he paused, entered, and approached the same curator who had once displayed the empty bowls from the festival of nothing happening. He unfolded the page and offered it WORD SSLY. The curator studied it for a long time. Then she smiled and nodded, and without asking questions, placed it into a simple frame. It was hung beside the display labeled "The Year of No Particular Events," right between a spoon carved by someone who never finished their meal and a handkerchief embroidered with the word, eventually. There it hung the last page, marked by nothing, folded once and smoothed again, holding in its fibers the quietest goodbye. Visitors who passed by often tilted their heads, unsure why it was there. But those who lingered noticed the gentle beauty of it. A calendar page, unremarkable, yet full of everything that hadn't happened. A relic not of action, but of time held gently. The museum began including the page in its quiet tours. A small sign below it read, December 1732, not crossed off, not forgotten. People began leaving small notes beside it. Most said nothing. Some contained words like, I remember, or it passed softly. Others were just blank slips folded in neat triangles. And in that village, in that uncelebrated moment between years, people found peace in the knowledge that not all transitions need to be declared. Some can arrive like snowfall, soft and steady. Others like a breath, exhaled without thought. The final page had turned. And with it, the world continued not new, not changed, but present. Simply present. And somewhere, deep within that presence, was the soft sound of time continuing its gentle walk. In this quiet rhythm, they found the comfort of things unchanged. A comfort in knowing that even when nothing announces itself, the world still turns. A sense that meaning can exist not only in moments that erupt, but also in those that dissolve. And so the village continued. Bread was baked, wool was spun. The river moved slowly, obedient to gravity and to time. And the page, folded and framed, remained a testament to a year that whispered its farewell. No bells, no parades, just the soft acknowledgement that something had passed and something else had begun, not loudly, but with grace. The boy returned often, though he never said why. He would stand before the page and look, not at it, but through it, as if seeing time itself held gently between glass and memory. And each time he left, he did so a little slower, as if learning how to carry the weight of time that made no sound. For in the end, the final page was never really about what it marked. It was about the space between things, the pause between years, the quiet where everything rests. And in that quiet, they slept well. At the edge of the village square, in a chair worn smooth by decades of use, an old man sat watching the clouds. He did this often. He had no schedule, no appointments, and no particular reason to watch the sky, except that it was there, and he was here. The sky moved slowly, and so did he. His blanket, tucked over thin legs, had lost its color to the sun. His cane leaned against the armrest, though he rarely used it. The air was cool that day, soft with the scent of resting soil and chimney smoke. Children occasionally passed by, some greeting him with a polite nod, others waving as they dashed off toward errands or daydreams. He would nod in return, but never speak unless spoken to. Most had come to regard him as part of the scenery, like the stone well or the elm with its one low-hanging branch. Permanent, observing. On this particular afternoon, a young girl approached. She had no errand and no clear reason for pausing, but something in her rhythm slowed when she neared him. Perhaps it was the silence surrounding his stillness, or the way his eyes remained fixed on nothing in particular. She stood quietly for a moment. Then she asked, "Did the year end yet?" The man blinked slowly, not at her, but at the thought. He shifted just enough to glance down the cobbled street, then back at the sky. "I'm not sure," he said, his voice like warm paper. If no one noticed the end, did it really happen? The girl tilted her head, but the calendar changed. "So it did," he murmured. "But did we?" She looked confused, but not unhappy. She had expected a simple answer, but what she got instead was something that felt like a pebble dropped into a Still pawned. The man leaned back again. Time doesn't always wait for us to catch up. Some years run fast. Others barely whisper. This one, it seems to have folded itself so gently into the next that I'm not sure where one ended and the other began. His words lingered. The girl sat beside him on the wooden bench. For a long moment, they watched the breeze play with the grass. A cat ambled across the square, tail swaying like a slow metronome. Somewhere, a door closed with the soft sigh of an old hinge. It feels the same, the girl said eventually. That's not always a bad thing, he replied. Sometimes sameness is safety, like knowing the sun will rise or the soup will be warm. He reached slowly into the side pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. With careful fingers, he opened it. It was a list not of goals or plans, but of days. Each one labeled simply, walk, sit, watch, listen. He pointed to the last entry, dated December 31st. It said only, breathe? And the next page? The girl asked. There isn't one, he said. I never needed it. Silence returned. But it was a companionable one, shared like a blanket between them. The rhythm of the village continued around them, soft footfalls on stone, the flutter of curtains, a broom rushing across a wooden porch. If we didn't mark the end, the man said after a time, maybe it means we're still living it. Maybe. A year doesn't need to end with a bang. Maybe it just lingers, waiting for us to notice. Or not. The girl, now with her chin on her knees, nodded slowly. Then I guess it's okay not to hurry. He smiled, the lines of his face deepening. Gently. That's the secret most grown-ups forget. The sun moved ever so slightly across the sky. Its light dappled the square in quiet gold. A bird settled on the rooftop nearby and simply sat. The air smelled faintly of bread and dust. People passed, and some slowed as they saw the pair sitting there. No one interrupted. A few paused briefly, then moved on, as though understanding something unspoken had transpired. And in that moment, between years, between generations, something settled into place. Not with ceremony or sound, but with presence. The kind of presence that doesn't need declaring. The kind that just is. Elsewhere, a new calendar hung in a hallway, its pages crisp and untouched. But here, beside the old man and the girl, time rested. Not racing forward, not dragging behind, just resting. Some said later that the man had offered wisdom. Others said he'd simply stated the obvious. But the girl remembered the quiet between his words more than the words themselves. The way they sat, the shared breath, the acknowledgement that perhaps not everything needs to be named to be real. And long after the bench had emptied, and the sky had shifted to its evening tones, that moment remained. A soft pause, a gentle breath, a question not needing an answer. If the year never ended, she thought, then maybe it still lives in us, in every gentle day that follows, in every unmarked page, in every time we choose to be still. And so the year lingered, and so did they. In the quiet, they rested. In the stillness that followed, the village continued to breathe. There were no fireworks, no banners, no declarations. But something had closed, gently, like the cover of a well-read book. The people of the village did not speak of endings, nor of beginnings. They simply lived. And in their quiet way, they carried with them the memory of a year that had asked nothing, but gave so much. Some said that 1732 was the year the world forgot to hurry. Others said it was the year they remembered how to be still. Nothing had broken. Nothing had been lost. Yet somehow, everything had changed. A kind of shift, barely perceptible, like the way shadows lengthen without warning. Children played in the same meadows. The blacksmith still hummed to his fire. The baker's dough still rose, evenly and without surprise. But beneath the ordinary, a deeper rhythm had taken root. A sense that life, unshaken and unshouted, could still be profound. The museum kept its new exhibit open through the spring. Visitors came not in droves, but in steady pairs and quiet individuals. They walked the halls slowly, reading placards aloud in hushed tones. Many lingered at the framed calendar page, some even writing in the guest book with phrases like, "A year that reminded me to breathe," or "I didn't know silence could be shared." The boy who had first taken the calendar page came less often, but when he did, he brought new offerings. A stone he had found by the river, a pressed flower from a path he had walked alone, a folded note that simply read, "Still here." The elderly man, too, was seen most days. He continued to watch the sky, and though he said little, he smiled more often now. There was a softening to him, as though the weight of many years had become a little easier to carry. The girl, now, a bit taller, sometimes joined him. They didn't talk about the year. They didn't need to. And when strangers asked, "What happened in 1732?" the villagers would look at each other, pause, and then say, "Not much," but their eyes told another story. One of gentle awakenings, one of quiet acceptance, one of peace not earned through triumph, but through presence. Because in a world that so often demands motion, it is an act of quiet defiance to be still. In an age that glorifies noise, silence becomes its own kind of music. And in years remembered for conflict or grandeur, a forgotten year stands as a sanctuary, a place where the ordinary was not only enough, but cherished. Epictetus once said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." And perhaps that was the lesson of 1732, a year that mastered itself by doing nothing, a year that taught people to be content without striving, to appreciate without acquiring, to live without needing to prove anything. The Stoics believed in the serenity of what is. That virtue comes not from control, but from acceptance. And so, too, did this quiet year show that not all progress is measured in events. Sometimes, stillness is the most meaningful step forward. Just as a tree does not need to bloom every day to grow, a life does not need to be loud to be lived well. Perhaps that is why the final days of 1732 felt like a gentle lesson, a soft turning inward, a reminder that peace is not the absence of noise, but the presence of calm. And in their beds, under soft blankets and thatched roofs, the villagers slept without fear of missing anything, because nothing was missed. And that, in itself, was a kind of perfection. So when the next year arrived, not loudly but simply, they welcomed it with the same humility. No resolutions, no grand plans. Just the slow unfolding of another series of days, each one like a page, waiting not to be filled, but to be noticed. And maybe, just maybe, 1732 never truly ended. Maybe it lingers in every quiet morning, every unhurried cup of tea, every breath taken without expectation. Maybe it lives on in the pauses between thoughts, in the soft gaze of someone watching the sky, in the gentle creak of a wooden floor, as someone tiptoes across it at dawn, because a year of nothing is still a year of being, a time when life returned to its roots, when meaning came not from motion, but from mindfulness. And so, dear listener, if you find yourself in a day with nothing to do, smile. If the wind sounds the same as it did yesterday, let it. If you forget what day it is, that's all right too. You have lived through the kind of year that history often skips, but the soul remembers. One that teaches by not teaching. One that stays by not asking to be remembered. And now, the fire grows low and our story rests. No more needs to be said. For you have heard the tale not of what happened, but of what didn't. And that, in its own way, is the most wondrous tale of all. Sleep well, friend. We'll meet again by the fireside.